Oh, thanks so much for joining me on this Monday. I'm excited to round out our Women's History Month today with all of our wonderful topics that we've been able to dive into around female health and hormones this last month. March has been a great time for really a sounding board of really having some awareness and conversations around some of these very real hormonal imbalance symptoms that a lot of women aren't necessarily getting answers for, they're living with, they're struggling with, and I really wanted to be able to at least spend some time diving into the ins and outs and the nuances to equip you guys with a much more confident conversation on how to either tackle these with your primary care provider or look for other practitioners like myself that can help you really navigate some of these challenges and changes as well. So we're going to round out our March Women's History Month here with a very common topic that comes into my clinic quite a bit, and that is perimenopause. So we'll discuss what perimenopause is and what it is not, what are some of the signs and symptoms of perimenopause, and where some of the classic treatment strategies tend to come in or recommendations come in for the perimenopausal woman, and how those aren't really hitting the mark, right? More often than not. I see women struggling through this perimenopausal transition without answers, and with a lot of band-aid solutions, and honestly a lot of very poor diet and exercise and lifestyle advice, as they try to force themselves into a hormonal picture that they really don't fit in any longer, and it makes matters worse. So we'll get an opportunity to talk about that, and then also some key strategies on how I think about and treat the perimenopausal picture, to help women really feel their greatest and their most confident and getting the most out of this hormonal time without beating their head against a wall and trying to use all of the tools that used to work for them in their teens and in their 20s, and now not so much. So time to switch gears and time to get some new tools, which is what it's all about. So if you've been really following our Women's History Month of topics, we've gotten a chance to cover some really cool topics of PCOS, PMS, even some conversations around PMDD, endometriosis, even some fibroid conversations. And really what we're seeing is this underarching theme of really protecting this progesterone to estrogen ratio. That is something that gets the first thing that tends to go haywire in a woman's metabolism with age is a natural decline in progesterone. And because of that, we can really display signs and symptoms of progesterone deficiency and or estrogen dominance. We don't have enough progesterone present to offset or calm down the effects of estrogen. So then that's all that we feel. Now, the hard part is estrogen is a very growth promoting hormone. It's very proliferative in many ways. So that's where we can see more of those risk association with that, and more symptom association with that as well too. So it's really important. Estrogen is not a bad guy. We just don't want unopposed estrogen, which means that we don't have enough progesterone to yin and yang the amount of estrogen in the system. So perimenopause is a very similar time, but we're seeing the progesterone decline as a result of advanced maternal age, or just getting more and more away from our reproductive and fertility years. So the focus really kind of switches, right? We want to really understand the importance of how do we protect this delicate progesterone to estrogen ratio, through things like anti-inflammatory nutrition and lifestyle strategies, supporting gut health for detoxification. If you were with us last week and hearing the conversations around endometriosis and how it truly is a total body inflammatory disease, things like perimenopause honestly aren't that far different. We're starting to see hormonal disturbances throughout the entire body, not just women's sex hormones. And it's honestly not just an ovarian syndrome or an ovarian issue. I think that's probably one of the most common misunderstandings of just the menopausal transition or the menstrual cycle of a woman in general, is we try, just like everything else in traditional medicine, we try to piece it apart and we just create a specialty for women's reproductive organs. And it's like, that's great. And we absolutely need that for certain situations. But we also need to recognize that women's sex hormones and women's reproductive organs don't isolate in a silo. They are part of the entire metabolic landscape. And quite frankly, they are the ones that get the most downstream influence of the entire metabolic landscape. So if our blood sugars are crazy and our adrenals are stressed out and our gut health is not in a great place, we have dysbiosis or we have infections or our gallbladder's not functioning correctly, or of food sensitivities and an inflammatory diet, like all of these things are really going to come together into not a great picture for women's sex hormones. So we can't think about them in a silo. We have to look at the entire body, because that's how these sex hormones are really going haywire in the first place. Now, the problem is that this perimenopause time is one of those times that's very, very misunderstood by traditional medicine, because it's a gray area, right? A lot of times we as humans like things to be black and white. It either is or it isn't. And when it comes to the metabolism and changes that happen over time and kind of a slow burn, there's usually not a designated like diagnosis, right? And it's really just this gray area where perimenopausal women kind of get tossed in between two specialties, where we have individuals that are helping people identify fertility or reproductive issues in our menstrual cycling years. And then we have enough practitioners too that are really kind of focusing on the postmenopausal woman and reducing risk of osteoporosis and all of that stuff. But what about the women in the middle? What about when we're done with the fertility or the reproductive part of our journey, but we're still having menstrual cycles? And so we're not yet menopausal, but we don't feel our greatest. We know our energy levels are declining. Our sleep sucks all of a sudden. Our periods are changing. And we just have a lot of then symptoms that are impacting our quality of life. And we may go to our healthcare practitioners, the same healthcare practitioners that were helping us in our fertility or our reproductive years, and we go to them and our symptoms sometimes get dismissed, or worse off, we're told it's all in our head, your labs are normal. And it's like, yeah, but I definitely don't feel normal. What I'm experiencing now, I know that this is not where I need to be, and I don't need to just struggle through it. That's really what I want women to be able to understand, is that really there is some opportunity here to dive into this perimenopausal picture with a lot better strategies and tools. We just need to understand, how is the perimenopausal woman different than our focus items in our reproductive and fertility years, and how is it different than the menopausal woman? So I don't want this perimenopausal time frame to really go unnoticed, just because it is a natural progression of aging, and it's not necessarily a disease diagnosis like a PCOS or an endometriosis. Doesn't mean it doesn't deserve its time in the sun, because I would say more and more women than not are really struggling with signs and symptoms of perimenopause, but not finding answers. So the perimenopause generation is honestly forgotten, because I call it the caretaker generation. It's usually where we're in between, like still caring for young children, but also maybe caring for aging parents. And in that in between there can be a really difficult struggle of stress, time, boundaries, juggling work-life balance, and trying to manage all of those different individuals that really depend on us. And so if it wasn't happening before, now is really the time where a lot of perimenopausal women tend to put themselves and their needs on the back burner. They get the scraps, they get the leftovers, whether that's the time or literal food scraps that are left over, and they tend to then just power through their day, really not running on much except for fumes. So that's why this tends to be a little bit more accelerated of a symptomology too, because we see the background of a lot of stress and cortisol kind of driving some of these natural declines in sex hormones as well too. So let's define some terms while we're here, just so we're all clear. What is perimenopause? Perimenopause is, like I said, kind of that gray area between I'm no longer focusing on fertility and reproductive years, but I'm not menopausal yet, right? So menopause is defined as a solid 12 consecutive months without a menstrual cycle. So even if your menstrual cycles are erratic, or you had like one and then didn't have one until 6 months later, you're not menopausal. You're perimenopausal, right? So it's that gray area that honestly can happen as early as in our 30s. Usually 35 to 45 is when a lot of those perimenopausal symptoms tend to become more of an onset. So I see a lot of women in their 30s and don't even, like, I say the term perimenopause and they didn't even have that on their radar. They had no idea that like some of these changes can happen in our 30s. Usually when we think perimenopause, it's like, oh, my mom. It's like, no, perimenopause is definitely something we should be preparing for in our 30s and our 40s, because then more of our 40s or 50s or sometimes even 60s for some women is more menopause. So this perimenopause is a gray area. It can start as young as 35 to 45 years old, and it can last anywhere from 5 to 15 years. So it's not just, like I said, cut and dry. That's why this weird gray area exists. And then women just kind of get tossed into this pool and don't have a lot of places to turn because their primary care providers are not really, don't have much for them to offer except for like birth control for some of the different period symptoms that are changing, or they offer them like an SSRI because my anxiety is higher. It's like, why are we not digging into some of these hormonal changes and fluctuations that are associated with changes in sleep and changes in mood and changes in menstrual cycles? Like, we can't just band-aid the solution and ask them to stay on those things until you're fully menopausal. It's like, this is one of our most important vital signs. We want to be able to have this. So since this is a gray area, what happens in perimenopause? Where would we really even know that we might be dealing with some perimenopausal type symptoms, or to call it perimenopause? Usually we see changes that are associated with a decline in progesterone first and foremost. So we're usually going to see changes in menstrual cycles, and this could go both directions. They could be shorter and lighter, or they could be longer and heavier, or some sort of mix, right? So a lot of women start to say like, you know, I used to be like super consistent 30 day cycle, and now I'm like 28 or 32, or they're only lasting 3 days where I used to have a solid 5 day period. Lots of different things can happen as just a result of the menstrual cycle changes themselves. We can also see an increase in anxiety and irritability is a big one, because progesterone is nature's Xanax. So as we start to see these progesterone levels declining, changes in anxiety is very, very common. But something like prescription medication for anxiety doesn't always meet the mark, right? It may not be something that is really remedied there, but we can use some bioidentical treatments to really look at progesterone levels. Also difficulty sleeping, insomnia. So this could be someone that was like, I used to sleep really easily through the night, and now I wake up every hour on the hour, even if it's to pee. It's like that. Those are changes in usually those sex hormones, progesterone and estrogen. Night sweats can be a big one. Waking up feeling like sheets are drenched no matter what you do. Difficulty building muscle, or feeling like you're not seeing return on investment for what you're doing in the gym. Changes in libido, vaginal dryness, painful intercourse, those types of things are very commonly perimenopausal type symptoms, and or struggle losing weight, gaining body fat, but not really changing anything. Those are some of the classic perimenopausal type symptoms. You don't have to have all of them. It may just be something like anxiety or sleep that are really all of a sudden very different, right? So we want to really look at the whole body approach when we look at a perimenopausal picture, because we know that perimenopause is really just going to be an accelerated or exacerbated time of these sex hormones if we have other confounding variables happening in other parts of the body, which we'll talk about in a second too. So these symptoms of perimenopause honestly really come into play by being a perfect storm of kind of three major patterns, right? So we start to see the first pattern that we see in perimenopause is a decline in progesterone. You might still be ovulating, but you're not creating a really strong ovulation curve, so you're not creating enough progesterone to offset the estrogen, right? So a progesterone deficiency is picture number one. Picture number 2 of perimenopause is unstable estrogen, usually described as like an estrogen roller coaster. It's like, I don't know if I'm high or if I'm low. I have symptoms of both. I'm like, yep, that's classic perimenopause because it swings high and drops low, highs and lows. So low progesterone, unstable estrogen, and the third picture that completes this perimenopause is increased cortisol. Cortisol, you guys have heard me talk about it time and time again because I'm always going to go back to this total body approach. Cortisol is our body's stress hormone. It is released from the adrenals. It is very catabolic. That's its whole job, right? Is to come out into the system when things are a little bit erratic or awry. And it's like, okay, I need to break down tissues in order to meet energy demands right now. It sees an energy discrepancy and cortisol is going to fill it. Now, we don't always like how cortisol goes about that because cortisol's job is to break down muscle in order to satisfy those needs, right? To liberate amino acids and energy stores. So that's where in perimenopause it becomes so exponentially important to support muscle, not just through diet, but also exercise in a way that's really like maximizing muscle growth, but also minimizing muscle loss. So it takes a lot more than we think it does. But meanwhile, all of the perimenopausal women out there that are struggling with their weight, what do? They go on these crazy crash diets. They cut their breakfast out. They start intermittent fasting. They cut their carbs and start going keto. They go on weight loss drugs and start eating nothing. They run extra 2 miles at the gym doing cardio or start doing 2 a days, like start drinking protein shakes for breakfast. It's like all of these wild things that these poor, desperate perimenopausal women will go to because they just don't have the education to understand their body. And it's like they are coming in with really, really well intentions of trying to right the ship or control this kind of downward spiral, but they don't realize that they're making it worse. Everything that I just mentioned there, not strategies for the perimenopausal female. Nope, not at all. So we need to come at this from a way different approach and recognize that, hey, it's okay. The strategies and the tools that I used to use of counting calories and doing cardio in my 20s and my 30s to lose a quick 5 or 10 pounds, that's not going to work. You do that and you end up like gaining weight. And then what do? You just start doing that harder. I'm like, this is not a conversation of like you not working hard enough. It's like, ooh, someone hands me like a protocol or a plan and I need to plan harder. I'm like, no, you need a new plan is what you need because whatever you're doing is not working. It's not that you need to do it harder or you're not doing it good enough. You need an entirely different plan. So trying to really meet the perimenopausal woman where she's at, doing some really in-depth testing to make sure that we know exactly what we're looking at and what we need to support from this really 3-step picture of, is this a progesterone deficiency? How do we want to go about treating that? Is this some unstable estrogen on a roller coaster? How do we want to support detoxification? And also, what are we looking at from an increased cortisol standpoint? What does that nutrition, lifestyle look like to make sure that we're not adding more stress onto the plate? So most women who have some of these perimenopausal symptoms, they tend to go, like I said, to a traditional medicine practitioner. Maybe they go to their OB and they are really looking for answers. And most of the time, what do they get? Usually a birth control, right? It's like, hey, I know things are wonky, that estrogen is all over the place. Your periods have gotten heavier, more painful. Let's just take a birth control and let's just go ahead and just shut that off. And then when you're menopausal, you can just come off of it. It's like, oh my gosh, no, we need to have a conversation around like, why is it heavier? How can we support it? Do we really just need to shut off that woman's 5th vital sign? Like that's going to be important information, not to mention some of the ramifications of a birth control potentially depleting major nutrients and gut health, all of that fun stuff, right? So birth control is a really common one that perimenopausal women get handed. Anti-anxiety medications or SSRIs is a very common one. Sleep sedatives or sleep assistance is another common prescription that they're given. Again, I'm not dogging on these saying that there's no time or place for them. I'm just saying there's no time and place for them without a conversation about how the holistic picture is supported first. or these women get sucked into deep restrictive diet culture, right? Because like I said, classic diet dogma is not going to work for the perimenopausal woman. So they go to their doctor who puts them on like an SSRI or birth control and tells them to eat less, move more. Those are all the completely opposite things that I would do for a perimenopausal woman, right? That is not going to work. And in fact, she's going to run her cortisol further and further through the roof and run her results further and further into the ground. She's going to come back next year, probably 10 pounds heavier. And now she needs an anxiety med and a sleep med too. It's like, what are we doing? What is the root cause approach here? And so they get sucked into these deep restrictive diet culture. Like I said, I know the weight loss drugs are running rampant right now. Endless restriction, elimination diets, fasting, counting calories, eating clean, killing themselves with cardio. None of that is going to work. Not to mention, a lot of these women also go into their practitioners and just get dismissed. It's like, oh, it's a normal part of being a woman or a normal part of aging. And I just don't buy that. I really just don't. I think that there are so many more resources, both in, yes, Western medicine, but also a functional medicine approach that can provide these women a combination of tools that really give them their quality of life back. There's no reason to white knuckle and struggle through this 5, 10, 15 years of life that this might carry on in this perimenopausal transition, because there's just so many resources. We just need to make these resources known and help these women really seek help outside of maybe their traditional medicine practitioner. So when I think about perimenopause, I treat it the same exact way as I would treat any hormonal imbalance. And we have to be looking at a root cause scenario. So we're zooming out and we're looking big picture, right? Understanding that the sex hormones are really just going to be responding to a lot of the foundational hormone hierarchy below it. So we really need to dial in things like adrenal support, first and foremost, blood sugar balance, correcting nutrient deficiencies, gut health and detoxification. Those types of things are going to be paramount. Then can we loop in some hormone replenishment or replacement strategies? Absolutely. There's definitely a time and a place to do this. We just want to make sure that we're putting that hormone replenishment into a system that knows how to deal with it. You're not going to really have the best outcomes of hormone replenishment or hormone replacement therapy if your gut health and your metabolic health and your stress is just through the roof. You have such an inflammatory system that we're trying to put this stuff into, and it's just not going to take, and it's not going to work. And that's where I know a lot of people have some mixed opinions about using some of the hormone replacement or hormone replenishment, which rightfully so, because I feel like there's some building blocks that should really be put in place first before we dive into those types of strategies, or you just don't get a great return on investment, right? We can't just use that as another band-aid solution or another quick fix. That's not how it works. Sorry. So when I see my perimenopausal women, I really want to envelop them into an integrative strategy, right? So the priorities become, first and foremost, lowering inflammation. Hands down, that is what we're going to be going after. Now, we do this nutritionally by lowering inflammation, really focusing on an anti-inflammatory diet, really focusing on blood sugar balance, really focusing on things like antioxidants, food triggers, the quality of your food, removing processed foods. That includes processed protein sources. Yes. So we can't just survive and thrive on protein powders and protein bars. That is not fueling yourself for perimenopause. And even if it is only 100 calories and it fits in your macros, no, it's not going to work. So don't try that style. Second priority becomes opening our drainage and our detox pathways, right? Very similar to the conversations we've been talking about with endometriosis, where we really need to make sure that we're mobilizing and stabilizing estrogen. That happens through the liver, that happens through the gut. If we don't have the drainage and detox pathways open in the liver and the gut, we're going to constantly reabsorb that estrogen picture. And now we're going to always struggle with that estrogen to progesterone ratio, and we won't have enough unopposed estrogen in that picture, which then exacerbates a lot of those symptoms. Third priority becomes supporting muscle mass, right? We're going to be looking at things like protein intake, protein quality, protein timing, strength training. Cool it on the high intensity cardio here. You're just going to exacerbate that muscle breakdown and that muscle loss. So this is the time where it's like, hey, maybe we would feel better doing shorter, more intentional workouts than these long drawn out boot camps that have your heart rate in the 170s the whole time and your spin classes. Just saying. And then last but not least, fourth priority becomes bioidentical hormone replenishment or hormone replacement. But like I said, those types of things come into play very strategically and usually work best when we have the foundations in place first. So I don't think that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. I think everybody kind of finds their own mixture of utilizing some of these different tools, but I want everybody to understand that perimenopause really is no different. We need to be looping in nutritional therapies that are specific for this time. You will not be able to fuel yourself like you did in your 20s. You will not be able to diet the same way that you did in your 30s and drop a quick 10. It's not going to work that way anymore. We need to learn how to view food and movement differently and utilizing, like I said, yes, some supplemental support. We need to look at cortisol and really make sure that we're targeting a total body approach here. So no more Band-Aid approaches for my perimenopausal women. No more just conversations of going into your doctor's office and feeling dismissed from your symptoms. No more living through a poor quality of life when you feel some of these symptoms really raging. And I think that there's better strategies out there. If you're curious about those, please seek out a practitioner like myself that really knows how to dive into a whole body view and take your whole health into consideration when making some of these recommendations and strategies. If you want to learn more specifically about perimenopause, I do have a perimenopause course at Renew University. I'll make sure to link that in the caption here. So there is a quick course guide to perimenopause on my Renew University site. I believe that's still there for a whopping $29, my pre-recorded course. So it'll give you a little bit more insight and ideas into this perimenopausal female. And then after watching that course, if you feel like you want some more information or you want some more guidance in your perimenopausal journey, don't hesitate to reach out. Click the link in my bio, schedule a consult, get some comprehensive labs, and let's dive into your perimenopausal situation so that you can live your healthiest, happiest life in that gray area stage of life. So hopefully this perimenopausal conversation was helpful for you guys. If you had never even heard of the term perimenopause before, here you go. If you're a woman in your 30s, start living for perimenopause now. So ditch the diets, ditch the high intensity cardio. It's going to come back to bite you harder the farther that you get into it. So time for some new tools in that toolbox. So tune in next week for more Learn with Lo as we take on a new month and a new series of topics.